not, because it's been it has been sent to the journal for publication, but now it's really very difficult to predict what's next. But okay, so that's not really a point of what I'm going to talk today. So I start with the brief motivation, what motivates our study, then I will go briefly through the theoretical framework. Although I tried to organize this paper to make it understandable for the wider audience, not economists. Still, I need to relate it a little bit to the theoretical framework and existing empirical examinations worldwide, well, not worldwide, but in Kazakhstan. Then I will go through the background, providing a background information regarding generally the problem in Kazakhstan and current Kazakhstan, and speaking a little bit about the labor market, because it's basically the problem related to a labor market. Then again, I will try to skip this as much as possible methodology, and then I will elaborate on our outcomes. And hopefully we will have time for questions as well. So gender equality is one of the key United Nations Millennium Development Goals, as you all might know, and Kazakhstan, as many other countries, adopted the National Strategy for Gender Equality. So the last one was adopted in 2006, and it aims at empowering women, eliminating discrimination in the labor market, and promoting equal pay for equal work. However, despite the proclaimed policy, the country, as other countries, generally all the countries in the world, constantly witnesses a gender wage gap at a level of about 25–26%. And the research questions which we address with this study: what are the causes of this observed gender wage gap? Is it a result of women's, say, choices regarding certain areas of economic activities, or the result of gender discrimination in the labor market? And to what extent each of these contribute to the overall wage gap? Well, in economics, we tend to relate a wage to productivity. So we believe that in a competitive labor market with perfect information, and these two things are obviously crucial, higher wages should indicate higher productivity. So people with higher, say, capital, high human capital endowments, higher productivity should have higher wages. However, sometimes workers with same level of human capital endowment and productivity, and these two are we believe determined by education, skills, experience, and personal characteristics, like, for example, motivation, attitude, and so on, do not earn comparable wages, and or, as we say, wages adjusted by compensating wage differentials. By wage differentials, we mean well, so sometimes some jobs can be comparable in a sense that we compare wage plus something else. So, for example, better labor conditions, or maybe higher level of social protections, benefits, additional benefits, and so on and so forth. And we call this the wage adjusted by the compensating wage differentials. And in this case, if it is such case, we call this discrimination in the labor market. So people with the same level of productivity and same level of human capital are not doing the equal work, of course, are not paid in the same way. And it could be driven by different socio-demographic factors, and with regards to gender. So we can talk about the different forms of this discrimination, of course, and with regards to gender discrimination, it is often driven by, for example, the fact that household duties, all those things related to childbearing, child caring, and so on, are disproportionately more performed by women, leaving them with a little chance or smaller chance for self-fulfillment, career advancement, and getting better paid jobs. Yeah, so their career, for example, could be intermittent, and so on and so forth. So generally, the topic is well researched in economics across the world. However, for Kazakhstan, of course, the data is limited, as for any microeconomic topic in Kazakhstan. And there are maybe possibly a few studies. Some of them are listed here. So, for example, the earliest one I think was dated back 2001, and they found out that the wage gap widened during the transition from the communist to I don't know, whatever economy we have now, due to a negative impact of economic reforms and weakening of the wage regulation mechanisms. I will stop on this at this point a little bit because it's important. There are also some other studies, but the point is that all of these studies, or most of them, were conducted on aggregated data. So aggregated data is, for example, the average wage at the industry level or whatever, but not the individual level data. And of course, when we have certain level of aggregation, information is sort of blurred. So we gain an advantage of having the individual level data collected by the national agency, National Bureau of National Statistics, and we think that it gives us a certain advantage in in exploring this topic. So some background information. In Kazakhstan, the labor force participation rate is the share of people who work among the working age population. Who participate in the labor. They might not work, but for example, search for the job actively, and we call them unemployed. So it is relatively high for both men and women, and for both genders, around 70–80%. And this is due to, firstly, because the average wage is generally low and doesn't allow one's spouse to support their family alone. Secondly, because women in Kazakhstan have high and even higher level of education, and this should motivate them to apply the acquired human capital in the labor market. Yeah. And also historical past should be noted, because in the Soviet Union, work was considered as a duty, not only a right of a Soviet citizen. And the women's plight was in the labor market and generally in the economy was relatively equal to that of men because of the ideology of the communist regime and generally Marxist ideology. Also, during the Soviet time, it was a relatively high level of social protection of both men and women, working men and women. Yeah, well, basically everyone worked, so of, say, all population. And this was, for example, publicly funded healthcare and recreation, universally paid maternity leave, rich maternity leave, and also the availability of universal childcare. So this is what we came with to the beginning of 19th. However, despite the declared gender equality at work, in the labor market, household responsibilities, and this is generally very similar to other countries as well, were not really equal, because women were considered as the main contributors to household duties, while men were considered as the main breadwinners, bread earners within their families. And this caused gender or horizontal segregation across industries, occupations, and jobs. Yeah? Because of the structure of the Soviet economy, industrialized structure of the Soviet economy, women were mostly concentrated in a relatively worse paid jobs that were white collar jobs, while men were concentrated in the better paid jobs, being the main breadwinners of their families. And within the industrialized Soviet economy, these industries were mining and quarrying, heavy industry, and manufacturing. And this was further fortified by job restrictions that prevented women from engaging in unsuitable and hazardous occupations that were typically more generously remunerated. However, at the same time, wage inequality was not that high. There is no data about the specific level of wage inequalities in the labor market in the Soviet economy, but it was believed to be high. It is believed that it was high because it was compressed by wage grids and wage leveling. And generally, level of economic equality was obviously much, much higher in the Soviet during the Soviet era. So this all caused the situation that female ended up by having higher level of education in the Soviet during the Soviet era, but this higher level of education amongst females increased even further with the after the collapse of the Soviet Union and with the country obtained its independence. And here you can see the statistics for the so we specifically analyzed these years because we only have data from 2011 until 2019. We have data for 2012 as well, but we decided to remove it since it was a very different year with possibly the consequences of the COVID restriction being already pronounced. So you can see that, so this is the level of education and this is not our data, which is sample, but this is the data of the national statistics, segregated national statistics data. And you can see that, so generally most of population, around half of population in Kazakhstan have technical and vocational education. But for females, the share of those with higher education is much higher. And also it was increasing at a higher rate. Okay, in comparison with men, for whom this is the case for the technical vocational education and training. So in the current Kazakhstan, we have the situation when women have excessive human capital compared to men, both in terms of education, but also in terms of skill. Well, maybe not excessive, but in terms of skill, because of the quality of education, possibly quality of higher education, but at least the same. Yeah, and it was confirmed by, for example, the OECD survey of adult skills that has been conducted in Kazakhstan in 2019, that found out that Kazakhstan appears among those few countries where there is no gender difference in numeracy proficiency. So what they did, they basically found, they basically sampled people, and they had a test in numeracy literacy and problem solving in technologically rich environment. It was found that in Kazakhstan, generally in Kazakhstan, people score below the OECD average. And this is the case for both genders, but there is no basically gap between females and male proficiency in numeracy, and also, well, generally for the other test dimensions as well. However, the labor market is characterized even by higher level of gender, industrial and professional segregation than it was during the Soviet time. Yeah? And it is, so from the theoretical point of view, it should be possibly explained. There are many different, competing theories explaining why it might be the case, but we believe that the most maybe relevant here is the compensating wage differentials that I have mentioned already. So the point is that women are more likely to choose jobs that do not require heavy physical effort, have shorter working hours, and provide high levels of social security, which altogether to some extent can compensate for low wages. Yeah, and this is again because of their roles of main contributors to the family duties, child rearing, child caring. So we can see from the national statistics data again that industries preferred by women, where female employment exceeds 66%, are such industries as education, healthcare, agriculture, wholesale, and retail trade, and all these industries have below country average level wages, average wages. While the industries that are preferred by men, such as mining and quarrying, manufacturing, construction, transportation, and storage, they all have above average wages in our economy. Yeah? But there are also the so-called gender neutral industries, and they include sectors with both high minimum and low earning, and these are, for example, financial activities and so on, such one with the highest wages in our countries, but also the low wages industries as well, such as, well, a few of them I will show them in a minute. Additionally, many of the better paid industries still in Kazakhstan are those engaged in heavy physical activities and hazardous activities that are banned from women. I've just knew that, well, just 20 minutes ago, so that this ban was basically, so it's not anymore the ban, but it doesn't really change the picture, because, well, still they have the physical, they still have these characteristics, and possibly a simple, declining the ban or removing the ban would not attract more females to those industries. So here I show you again the national statistics data. So these dots are the industries, and I showed the share of male employees in each industries and in this vertical axis, and the share of employees engaged in heavy physical activities and engaged in hazardous activities. So generally, you can see that the higher the share of employees engaged in such activities, the more male dominated industries this are. Okay. And what interestingly, over the period under analysis, so again, it is the so around 10 years from 2011 until 2016, we observed again with the national statistics data, so it's not sample data, it's national statistics national level data. We see that industrial segregation increased. Yeah, so you can see that. Well, at least in some of the worst paid industries are listed here. Based on the average wages, yeah, observed over this year. So I took the average wages and then ordered the industries from the best paid, which is mine and inquiry, financial activities, financial insurance activities, and so on, to the worst paid, and the worst paid are education and agriculture, forestry and fishing. Okay, and you can see that at least in some of the best paid jobs, here is the number of employees in 2011 and in 2019. The number of male employees increased to a larger extent than female employees, and at least at some of the worst paid industries, the number of male employees decreased. While for females, with exception of education, generally there is no really large changes across these years. And this is not really really surprising, since men all over the world have higher mobility in the labor market, yeah, in choosing employment, because they are sort of more risk prone and they have to sacrifice. And in case of Kazakhstan, they have to sacrifice possibly a certain level of social protection due to their role of breadwinners. Because if you would go back to the industries, you can see that, for example, mine and inquiry, that is B here, is among those where you have the largest share of employees engaged in hazardous and heavy physical activities. Okay, so they have high level of mobility, and they react in the changes of the wages by what we call relative wage, by changing their employment towards better paid, more lucrative industries. What else? Over this period, the wage inequality across industry is high in Kazakhstan. So this is the simplest coefficient of variation. This is just that you take the standard deviation divided by mean. So if the standard deviation is small, then this coefficient should be small. So it is relatively high in Kazakhstan, where it's pretty high, but also you can see that it's not really decreased, or it sort of maybe even were sort of increasing or something like that. And this happened mostly due to the best paid industry. So you can see that the rate of increasing of the wages across these years for the best paid industries is a sort of, so the speed of increasing is sort of higher than for the worst paid industries in Kazakhstan. There is also the high level of wage inequality across regions, the provinces, oblasts, and the coefficient of variation is a little bit smaller, but it's more or less comparable. Okay, but if you would look at the same plot showing the distribution of employed workers across these regions in 2011 and 19, separately for men and women, you can see that, yes, indeed, this possibly caused the migration of population to the best paid regions that are the oil extracting and exporting regions, and also Nur-Sultan and Almaty, from the worst paid that are traditionally the southern parts of the country. But generally, there is no striking difference. Well, there is no basically difference across genders. Also, they look more or less similar across genders, not surprisingly. There are also other sources. So what I'm trying to say here, that because of the increase, well, maybe increasing or maybe still pretty high level of wage inequality across industries, and men being more risk-prone and better, more flexible in terms of changing their employment. They've been reacting to this, wage inequalities by changing their employments towards the better paid industry, and that contributed to, so basically it is the, not contributed, but it is basically what we call the industrial segregation of genders across industries. Yeah, so also there are another sources of wage inequality in Kazakhstan. These are the residential location. In rural area, not surprisingly, you all know that in rural area, employees have much lower salaries than in urban area. But it also company ownership. So public company employee has around has wages that are average wages that are just a half of the wage of a private company employee. However, private sector employment often requires more effort and commitment and has lower level of social security. So we still have this back pay, tax and social security contribution evasion, unwritten verbal contracts, and so on and so forth in the private sector versus high level of stability in earnings and social packages, paid sick leave and maternity leave in public sector. And again, if you would look at the sectors, and this is the second contributing factor to the wage inequality across genders, the private sector is chosen disproportionately more by men workers than women workers. So in our sample, I couldn't find the national statistics data, but in our sample, 72% of male, while only were engaged in private sector, where only 40% of women have been doing the same over the period under analysis. Okay, so the data. So we used, as I said, individual level data. This is the repeated cross-sectional data collected by the Bureau of National Statistics and collected with something called household budget survey for each of this year. So basically, it's each quarter of each year. We ended up by having this sample of only wage earners, employees, yeah? And this is a pretty large sample of more than 100,000 observations. We have data on individual level annual wages. We have the respondents' individual characteristics, specifically gender, age, education, marital status, not that many, unfortunately. We also have some characteristics of the workplace, industry, where they work, and company ownership. Unfortunately, we don't have neither profession nor the position within the company. And also we observe the region and residence. Region is oblast, and residence is urban or rural residency. Data obviously has limitation, and I should stress this. So firstly, we have annual wages. And since women believed to normally work fewer hours than men, this could lead to the overestimation of the gender wage gap. Yeah? However, it might also have some benefits, some advantages, yeah, because the gender gap is in annual earnings reflect differences in wealth and purchasing power between men and women. For example, when you take when bank makes a decision of granting a loan, it considers not the hourly but the average wage. So it's a better indicator. On the other hand, it's sort of a better indicator of the actual living standards of people. Also, we have only working employees, and if you're familiar with this whole statistical theory of endogeneity, you might know that this potentially might cause and possibly causes endogeneity, because we only observe people. So we observe wages given a person already works. Yeah, so we cannot basically generalize these results towards other people who, for example, don't work. We made an attempt to adjust this with the by using something called Heckman correction, but we found out that there is basically the results are basically the same, because the probability of being sampled, and sampled means here being working, both for men and women were found not to be correlated with the wages. And this result is sort of surprising in the sense of international comparison, but it's not really surprising if you would look at the other papers using the data from from the former Soviet countries, because former Soviet countries, because it's possibly there is a different nature of self-selection into employment in this transition economies in comparison with developed economies. And also the other important limitation is that we do not observe all important sources of gender, of cross-gender wage differentials. So for example, we do not observe occupation, that is important as well, or for example, parental background, personal characteristics, skills of the workers and so on, when they observe their education level. Okay, so I'll try to go briefly through the methodology without, getting into details of technicalities. What we do, we first estimate the simplest, what is called Mincer's wage equation, where we explain the wages at the individual level observed for these 100,000 people, with their level of education, with the personal characteristics, the job characteristics, and the in-play place of residence characteristics. That we also use the dummy variable for each year. And that's basically it. And this allows us to find the gender, the difference across genders, whether it's statistically significant and what is different. And then we do something called Osaka-Blinder decomposition with numeric correction. And so it's a bit complicated formula, but the idea is pretty easy intuitively, because it shows to what extent each of those characteristics contribute to the wage inequalities across genders. So you can say what is the share of the contribution of, for example, education into the wage inequalities, or for example, industrial segregation and so on. All right, so now I'm showing the outcomes. So the first part is just the simple, documentation of the gender wage gap. So it's found, on average, it's found to be 27% during these years, and there is no really, there is no any, the pattern across years. So it's approximately 26% in each of these years from 2011 until 2019, fluctuating around this mean. We also found, not surprisingly for me, we found that females have higher returns to education, and I find this with any data in Kazakhstan, with the higher level of returns to high level. So females with higher education have higher wages than male with higher education. Well, when we compare to similar workers. And for females, this returns premium for the higher education is 43% on average, again, with the whole pooled sample, and for men it is 29%. So not surprisingly, females have high level of education because it is better paid than in males in Kazakhstan. Well, again, it might be a bit surprising for, if you are not familiar with the labor economics literature, because it's normally takes place in, occurs in the countries, in developing countries where females have lower level of, lower accumulated human capital. But it is not the case in Kazakhstan, so it's basically just the feature of the labor market, specific labor market. And again, I'll try to elaborate on that a little bit later. We also found the wage differentials in private versus public sector, and they found to be, well, it's not surprising that they are found in our data because it is typical for the country, but also they're different across genders, because for men, because a man employed in a private sector earns 15% higher wage than a man employed in a public sector. So the difference in wages for men between private and public sector is around 15%, but for women, this difference dropped to 3%. Okay. Also, we found the wage inequality across industries, and it also found to be sharper for men than for women. And also there are interesting characteristics regarding, the gender roles and possibly the gender family roles, because the wage of married women, unsurprisingly, found to be 21% lower than the wage of the unmarried women, And this is consistent with the productivity theory, because due to additional responsibilities related to childcare, housework and so on, they sort of make little effort related to paid work and thus have lower productivity and wages in comparison with men. The opposite is true for married men, but because they are so married men earn higher wages than unmarried men, yeah? And this is again consistent with their main status of a main bread earner. But also unmarried female have higher wages than any other females. Yeah, so generally, again, pretty much consistent with the, say, family economics and all these things. Region and residents also have, of course, expected outcomes, but they are similar across genders. So they do not really different across genders. Okay, and then we did this Oaxaca-Blinder decomposition for each year separately, and then for each region separately. Not for each region, but for region subgroups, a larger region subgroups. So for each year, what we found that, as I said already, the gender wage gap doesn't show really clear dynamic, so just fluctuating around this mean, but there is a very apparent decrease in its unexplained part. So with this decomposition, we can say that this part of the wage inequalities is explained by our characteristics that we assume determine gender wage gap. And this part is left unexplained. And normally in economics, we believe that if we, if we use all characteristics that should determine the wage inequalities, this unexplained part, it is something related to discrimination in the labor market, because we now see, we compare to similar workers based on those characteristics that should be important for their wages, yeah, systematically important. And we see that men still earn high wages, and we say that it is discrimination. So all this glass ceiling and so on things. So we see that it was decreasing over this period of time, and it was decreasing in an interesting way. Since women in Kazakhstan have excessive human capital compared to men, I said they have high level of education, and also experience was, somewhat significant in our models. This excessive human capital actually contributed to reducing gender wage gap. So specifically, education has reduced gender wage gap over this period by 17.25%, yeah, because women are more educated on average. However, at the same time, it was a striking increase in the contribution of industrial segregation to this gender wage gap. And it increased from, so generally 19%, so the gender industrial segregation contributed in a share of 19%, yeah, in 2011, and it soared to 30, so almost twice in 2019. And this increase in the contribution of industrial segregation to the gender wage gap is not offset by a positive effect of improving human capital. Yeah? So in other words, gender wage gap might actually decrease in 2019 with comparison to 2011 due to improved females human capital, but it didn't due to increased industrial segregation. We also observe something like that for the sectoral segregation across private and public sector, but the effect is smaller, it's more modest. And then we did the same thing, but for regions, pooling the years, and we divided, well, we didn't do that for each of the oblasts, but we sort of combined this oblast into larger geographical areas. And these geographical areas have certain common characteristics, common borders, of course, but also certain common characteristics. So we separated two largest cities, Nur-Sultan and Almaty, in the group called metropolises. Then we separated all Western oil producing and exporting regions that are Aktubetro, West Kazakhstan, Mangistau in one group Western. We did so for Southern and also Central and Northern regions. And so generally, if you would look at the industrial structure of these regions, you would see, well, this is a completely different story in Nur-Sultan and Almaty, of course, and it is different in our estimations as well. This is oil producing and exporting regions, yeah, with the highest level of inequality generally in wages, and also the highest level of the gender wage inequality. There is also the case for industrialized, but not oil producing, but still exporting central parts of the country, central regions of the regions of central Kazakhstan. And the wage gap found to be the smallest in the poorest regions. In the southern Kazakhstan, it is the smallest, and also in northern Kazakhstan, so more in the more agricultural areas. And this might sound a bit surprising for you, but it's not surprising for me because you know, in economics we know that inequalities is higher where the wages are higher, and it is lower. So it's lower in poor, you know, units. So I'm not going to stop in these numbers, but because I have the sort of you know, interpretation for the regions in the next slide. So what we found in the northern and southern, the poorest regions of the countries, the gender wage gap is sort of modest, and it's basically it's comparable with the, you know, developed European countries, like for example Germany, France, I don't know, Austria, or the continental countries, and it is even higher in, for example, United Kingdom and United States. We also found that females better, at these northern and southern parts, females' better education substantially decreases the gender wage gap and nearly overweights negative effect of industrial segregation. Yeah? So here, for example, for this region, further improving females' human capital might narrow down gender wage gap even further. However, for the western and central parts of the country, most industrialized and relatively rich, yeah, so this is the middle income region and this is the highest income region, the gender gap found to be the highest. It's almost 40%, and this is comparable if you want international comparisons. It's comparable, it's higher than in South Korea, where it is pretty high, and well, say sort of comparable with, for example, Arabian countries, where it reaches up to 50%, and so. So it's very high, and also we found that it is pretty much well explained, yeah, and it is fully, almost, well, to a large extent, it is not almost fully, no, sorry. To a large extent, it is explained by this industrial segregation in this region. So, for example, if you want policy recommendations for these regions to overcome industrial segregation and by making the best paid job more female-friendly with high level of social protection, low level of risk, and so on and so forth, and better access to females to better paid jobs. And for these two cities, metropolises, Nur-Sultan and Almaty, the story is completely different. So the gender wage gap is sort of average here. It's 25% over these years, but it is almost fully left unexplained. Yeah, so basically our observed characteristics do not explain whatever reasons for this gender wage gap. Why? Because at these two cities, we have almost equal allocation of the genders across industries. So there is no industrial segregation literally. Also, we have almost equal level of education, and it is pretty much, it is the highest, yeah, among all this region, it is the highest among all these regions in Nur-Sultan and Almaty, not surprisingly, because these two cities attract say better educated people from all over the country. So it is almost similar, but also it provides equal returns to higher education for men and women, comparable. Well, it almost equal. So our observed characteristics that we have in our data could not explain why this gender wage gap of 25% is still there. So we tend to explain it by vertical segregation. Vertical segregation means that, so if industrial or horizontal segregation is when, for example, females are trapped in worse paid industries, vertical segregation means that even being in the same industry, or maybe even in the same company, females sort of have less access to the best paid jobs that are normally managerial position, top position, and so on. So we call this, so it's possibly vertical segregation, which we want to test with the next study, and it is testable with our data, and also possibly gender discrimination. So as I said, the limitation is that we do not have we do not observe occupation, and if we, for example, would have occupation in our data, maybe the explanatory power of the model would increase with that. Well, it should increase, I believe, but it is not recorded in the data, unfortunately. Yeah, so that's it. If you have questions, hopefully it was more or less clear, because yeah, I tried to avoid technicalities as much as I can, but try to tell the story in a simpler way. So if you have questions, I'm happy to answer. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, dear Saule, for such an interesting presentation, very informative. Now we are opening the session of Q&A, questions and answers. If anyone would like to ask a question or just a comment, please go ahead. So we have about 10-15 minutes left until the end of the seminar. Yes, Gauhar Nursha, please.
Yes, good evening, dear colleagues. Yeah, I wanted to ask my question while my babies come, but okay, I hope I will handle this. First of all, thank you very much for this insightful research. Basically, I was following the one of the Sheryl Sandberg's project on gender wage gap in US and Latin America, Europe, and was really looking forward that we have something similar. And all these insights you've shared, the numbers are really, on the one hand, are amazing. On other, mostly it's very sad. And I'm sure that this, sorry for background noise, I think that it will be very helpful for policymakers and for international organizations as well. And so yeah, basically I don't have a kind of a question, but I just maybe missed this in the beginning. I wonder if this is like an ongoing research, like institutional research you are implementing, or it was like the it's done and you are not, because it will be very, of course, interesting to see the in 2021 and 22, like what will be happening like after the post-COVID times, and now when we again have this economic turbulence due to like recent geopolitical issues in the region. So yeah, so basically this question is, are you going to continue this, or it's done and then?
Yes,
Thank
it's
you.
ongoing work, and we will, well, I hope in the nearest future we'll start doing the second part, because, well, we just decided to not mix up different things here. And the second part, as I said, so it's a different model that allows to, disentangle this vertical segregation by looking at the different quartiles. So what we're going to do, we're going to compute something called quantile regression to see the differences across the quartiles of wage distribution, which will allow us to help whether it is the larger difference in a top, top best paid positions and so on and so forth. So, and of course, because of the already observed trends, we would possibly concentrate in these two cities where it is likely the highest level of vertical segregation. Yeah, and hopefully we'll publish it as well, because, well, to some extent it became complicated with all this, the last developments, because my co-authors are from Russia, and to some extent the publications are banned now. But well, publication is not of course, it's not the main aim. But of course, we want it to be referred first before. If your question was about whether are you going to familiarize policymakers with the results, I'm happy to, but first I want it to be published, maybe, but though I'm not really that much concerned with that anyway, but still we might get very good comments from the reviewers as well. So yeah, it's ongoing. It is ongoing work, hopefully with the continuation. Thank you, Gauhar.
If I may just to reflect, it's certainly success, all the success to publish, because really it's very hard. This data is, I think it will be very unique, and you will be successful with this. And of course, we can maybe talk later and think about maybe some to know further about some details of the research. If there are a way to also have this discussion afterwards, it would be also great. Thank you so much and good luck.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, the data is not really, it's not unique data at all. Well, I mean, you still need to do something to get access to this data, but it's, what surprises me why this topic hasn't been researched yet. But well, it's not really surprising because there are many topics that are heavily under research, especially for labor economics, still in Kazakhstan. But yeah, the data is just the national statistics data, which is collected by the survey. And basically, we might do that for a longer period because they started to collect this data from 2001, as far as I remember. But for some reason, the industry is not recorded in the data until 2011. That's why we try to do that, but it's, well, I mean, because of the huge contribution of industrial segregation, basically everything is left unexplained. So we ended up by using the data where the industry becomes available. I see the question in the chat. Yeah.
Yes, please. Janibek has raised a hand, and
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Saule. And yeah, you're absolutely right, I guess, in the sense that we don't have much researchers covering this topic, where actually we have one person here working on the same topic, wages, and then the difference and the gaps. So he couldn't join, unfortunately, but I have two questions, maybe just to clarify certain moments. The first one relates to your data. Does your data include the category of self-employed that we have in Kazakhstan? So it's a kind of quite a big number of people, I guess. So if it doesn't include, so how do you think whether, I mean, within that category, what would be the situation? The first question. The second question is about, okay, we had a discussion kind of a couple of weeks ago, and someone is saying that in Kazakhstan, men tend to go to jobs which are at higher risk. They're well paid, but at a higher risk, they are not socially protected, let's say. So in the times of crisis, then men tend to lose jobs more than women. So again, if we look at the industries where men and women work, and we see that, okay, this industry is the mining sector, the oil sector, and they're very prone to crisis, right? So how do you think, I mean, again, it's just to produce, if we face a serious problem, economic problem, so what would be the situation in that sense? So do you think that, okay, we're gonna see more men losing their jobs, or do you think that they will be kind of going to other sectors where normally more, let's say, women dominated? So what's your opinion on that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point, but I think it's sort of difficult to predict what will happen in reality, because yes, obviously our results are suggestive in a way that male workers are more, well, employees are more concentrated in riskier jobs and riskier sectors, and also in private sector that is also provides higher returns premium, but at the same time of a lower level of social protection. And of course, the prediction is obvious here that they will suffer more. When, I wouldn't say if, because it's already obviously that we will have very harsh tough time in the nearest future economically, they will suffer more. Yeah, that's true. But whether their higher level of mobility would allow them to, to move across sectors more easily. But I guess that, well, at least some of the sectors would be hit more by the current economic situation. And with regards to your question to the self-employed, I'm not sure I can answer this, because this data actually has self-employed as well. So, but I think it's a bit different story, and I'm not even sure for example, what sort of information we might get for self-employed, and we didn't even try, to be honest. That might be another research. I know one person who works pretty well with the same sort of data in Kazakhstan for self-employment, but I'm not sure if he, well, I mean, gender inequalities is not in his area of interest. I think that, so maybe, yeah, it's an interesting thing to do, but I'm not really sure what sort of data available with about the self-employed there, what is possible, what is doable, and what is not. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you for your recommendation.
Arman has next question, please.
Hi, Saule. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. As I understood, you are working with objective data, and I'm wondering, during the literature search, have you came across subjective data? For example, sociological survey about perceived discrimination, and if not, if you, so do you think it's worth studying by your team, and then probably compare whether the subjective data coincides with objective data, for example, like it's interesting picture across the regions and something?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not really sure what do you mean by subjective, like surveys or like
about perceived discrimination of women?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't do so, but in this data, this is certainly not available because it's just, there are no such questions. But I know some data sets that could be used for that. Yeah, because, for example, EBRD Life in Transition Survey, and they already had 3 waves, and they're gonna have the 4th one. I just clarified with them, and I know that they're gonna have the 4th wave this summer, and it's much smaller, but it is interesting, and also it's possible to use it for international comparison. Well, so it is possible to look at the perceived, because it is also important, right? But we didn't do so. No, with this data, and even with the literature search, we mostly concentrated on, as you said, what you call objective data. And also another possible interesting source of information is administrative data. And in Kazakhstan, we have we have administrative data, but we don't have institutionalized access to this administrative data. But possibly it's also an interesting sort of information, and maybe even competing in a sense of findings that we can get with them. But no, we didn't concentrate on perception of the gender gap, things like that.
Thank you so much, Saule. So there is another question in our chat box.
Yeah, so is it, in this perspective, what kind of realistic public policy responses can be designed to address this gap? Yeah, this is an interesting question, and what is especially, well, I mean, I'm not really a public policy person, to be honest, and not really that much familiar maybe with the development in public policy with this regards in Kazakhstan. What I know is mostly, the things that are sort of proclaimed, but whether they are working policies or not, I'm not really sure about that. And I think it's because I've just attended the event where we had, the representatives of the public sector, and also, public policy, and also the people from NGOs. And I found out that there is, for me, it was impression that they don't really that much understand what is the gender wage gap in economic sense. They've been talking about different things, and they've been sort of, mixing up all these different things. So it was my just very, very first impression. So I think generally for public policy in Kazakhstan, it's always a relevant question, because I didn't see any policy that, that could be economically titled as evidence-based policy. So I think that it's possible to provide a realistic realistic responses in terms of public policy. I mentioned them. So first of all, deal with this industrial segregation, increasing industrial segregation, increasing wage inequality within the sectors of economy, and so on and so forth. But also it might be different for different regions, depending on the industrial structure of these regions. So yes, I believe that well, at least we can give, just sort of general picture, wider picture, overview of what can be done and what is the direction of these possible reforms, and then to elaborate on that deeper.
Thank you, Saule. Thank you to Iqbaljan for the question. So we have another 3 minutes. If anyone would like to ask a question, please unmute yourselves. Danyar, yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Saule, for such a fantastic and interesting presentation. Even if I'm not competent enough in this specific topic, obviously, I have sort of, a common question. What are the limitations of your research? Is there a window for future you perhaps meant for
Yes,
young
please.
research in this specific topic that you've just
Well, thank you for your question. Well, of course, we always trust the limitations, and generally limitations come with, in our heavily quantitative research, limitations normally comes with the data unavailability. So, for example, as I mentioned, we don't have here detailed information on wages. We have a new wage that, of course, blur a lot of potentially important information. If we would have also hourly wage and can compare them, that would be maybe much more interesting picture. And we believe that this limitation would possibly lead to overestimation of the gender wage gap. And also, we don't observe occupation, for example. So we can say anything about the occupational segregation, because it is obviously that, because, for example, if you would look at the secondary school teachers, they are almost 100% females, and this last developments with regards to the wages of the public school teachers being increased might also have interesting consequences for the wage gap, specifically with regards to occupations. So these are the limitations related to the data and also to some extent methodology. So this methodology is it's a good thing, but it's really very complicated in terms of interpretations. And this is something that you need to spend a bit more time to understand what's going on by observing all these tables with the numbers. Can we access to your report? Yes, sure. I can send it if you would write up your email, or for example, I can send it to Mulder. Yeah.
Yes, I have a file of your research. Dear Laura,
All
could
right.
you post your email address, please, in the chat box? So Saule or me can send you the file directly. Thank you. So, here it is. Thank you, Laura. So I think it's time to wrap up our seminar. Thank you everyone for participation and your time. Thank you, first of all, Saule, for your fascinating presentation. We're looking forward to reading it as a publication in a journal.
Hope so. Thank you very much, guys. Take care.
Take care. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.